Hey YouTube, Jim here. Welcome to Top 10 Archive. Where's the line between curious researcher and mad scientist? Usually around the time when you start testing on unsuspecting humans. Experiments are just a lot of unknowns. So, when we start adding humans and their futures into that equation, ethics start to go out the window, and so does sanity. This is the top 10 scary experiments done on humans. But before we get started, why not subscribe and click the bell to get notifications of future scary top 10 videos. If you wind up enjoying this video, give it a like and share it with one of your friends. Oh, and leave us a comment about which scary top 10 video we should do next, if you dare.
Number 10. Psychic driving. An LSD experiment was conducted in Montreal by Dr. Cameron. The point of the experiment was to test mind control on 53 people who went to the Allen Memorial Institute for Psychological Treatment. Cameron attempted to rewrite the personality traits of his test subjects by using a mixture of LSD, electroshock, sleep therapy, and listening to recorded messages for 16 hours at a time. The experiment was even partly funded by the CIA as an attempt to use this experimentation as a weapon of war. The attempt to redirect the thoughts and actions of the patients didn't pan out. But what's worse is that the patients weren't told they were being experimented on. Cameron died in the 1960s, and his colleagues still deem him as a mad scientist who would stop at nothing to become famous for his accomplishments. Most of Cameron's patients are now elderly or have gone into anonymity, but the ones we know of have largely lost their sense of self and were never the same after the experiments. Number 9. MK Ultra. Speaking of LSD experiments, following Dr. Cameron's LSD tests on humans, the CIA decided to try their hand at it too, during not one or two, but at least 162 different projects. In its efforts to outsmart the Soviet Union, the CIA targeted drug-addicted prisoners, sex workers, and terminal patients who were unable to consent or fight back. They then researched how they could induce effects of alcohol or hypnosis, as well as the possibility of mind control. What ensued was a variety of highly unethical experiments performed in several universities around the country in which patients' rights were severely violated. Most of the records have been destroyed, which just adds fuel to the curiosity fire of the internet. What exactly took place? Where did the patients go after the experiment? Did anyone die? Number 8. San Quentin Prison Experiments. Leo Stanley was the chief surgeon at San Quentin Prison and the protagonist of many prison stories in the early 20th century. He started playing around with the idea of testosterone in inmates, believing convicts had lower levels. He believed if he could raise them, he could improve or eliminate their criminal behavior. Naturally, he decided to test the theory by transplanting inmates' testicles. First, he used those of executed convicts, and when those ran out, he started using animal testicles by liquefying and injecting them into the inmates' skin. This went unstopped and was done on approximately 600 inmates, while Dr. Stanley was convinced that the results were positive. Number 7. Uranium Injections by Dr. Sweet. Dr. William Sweet was a doctor that wanted to fight brain tumors. Seems honorable enough, right? Until, of course, this little catch comes along. He so badly wanted to find the cure for brain tumors that he didn't care what the cost was to get there, like injecting uranium into people. As we've seen with many mad scientists, he decided to run tests on unsuspecting patients. The test subjects were terminally ill, which he tried to use to justify his actions. Sweet claimed his subjects had all given consent, but since one of the patients was unconscious from the moment he entered the hospital and never regained consciousness, Sweet's ethics didn't stand well against criticism. Sweet experimented frequently on patients, at times under government sponsorship and secrecy, but his Boston experiments specifically are concerning. He attempted to destroy tumors by injecting them with a variety of elements, including boron. Number 6. UC experiment on newborns. Imagine being 1 hour old and having some doctor running experiments on you. You made it 1 whole hour without the world being a crummy place, and along comes some scientist that starts trying things on your tiny body. The University of California Pediatrics Unit took 113 small children, all less than 3 days old, and ran tests on them to measure blood pressure and blood flow. All this sounds pretty standard until you realize the types of experiments they were running. For example, they'd strap babies to circumcision boards and turn them upside down, or put them in ankle-deep ice water while a catheter was planted in their aortas. Number 5. Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. This experiment was carried out by the U.S. Public Health Service on what began as 431 infected men and 169 healthy African American men from the traditionally black Tuskegee University. The men were observed for the natural progression of untreated syphilis and told they were only getting free health care from the government as well as meals and free burial insurance, which probably should have been a red flag. And for what? They said they were being studied for bad blood, which was sometimes used to describe anemia, syphilis, and fatigue. The experiment lost funding but was continued without disclosing to the patients that they would not be treated for their disease, even after penicillin was a known cure. Not only were the 400 men affected by this awful treatment, some dying because of it, many of their wives and children contracted the disease or were born with it. It wasn't until 1997, 65 years later, when President Clinton apologized to the remaining and deceased victims on behalf of the country. Number 4. Please pass the mustard gas. On the topic of racially biased experiments, we have the U.S. military's brilliant experiment on their own soldiers. World War II was just an open playground for mad scientists. During the war, the U.S. military prepared for possible gas attacks by other world powers. How? By testing dangerous gases on racial minorities. African American, Japanese American, and Puerto Ricans were sprayed with several types of gases, including mustard gas. In more than 100 experiments, they'd be placed in wooden gas chambers or even placed in climates and landscapes similar to the Asian Pacific Islands and sprayed from planes. Apparently, they were looking for ethnic differences and advantages in different types of skin that could be exploited during a war. Scientists thought people with darker skin would prove more resilient, and Japanese American soldiers were told that they were being tested as proxy to Japanese soldiers. So, were white soldiers not tested at all? Well, actually, they were used as control groups to see what was normal as compared to minority soldiers. In total, more than 60,000 troops were experimented on. These soldiers not only had no choice in the matter, they also had to keep the tests strictly confidential. Years later, soldiers suffered from serious flares in their skin, large scabs, and their skin would fall off in flakes, but the government denied them any sort of benefit or health care. Number 3. Conversion therapy. Gay conversion therapy sounds like a joke, maybe because it calls for the transplant of testicles. While this sounds like an idea from the far past, the truth is that this type of therapy is still legal in most countries and in all but 14 states in the U.S. In Johannesburg, there are hard labor masculinity camps where young boys are put through awful conditions, and in 2015, a young boy actually died, looking malnourished and weak. All of this comes from the 1920s belief that homosexuality is a birth defect which can be treated and cured. Needless to say, most people who receive this therapy aren't consenting to it willingly and definitely don't receive any benefits from the practices. Number 2. Monster Study. This 1939 experiment was about studying the effects of abuse on stuttering in children. The premise is interesting, but the methods were questionable. Wendell Johnson took orphans and split them into 2 groups, those who'd receive positive speech therapy and negative speech therapy. The first group would receive compliments and encouragement on their fluency of speech, while the second would be belittled for mistakes. It wasn't originally called a monster study, but other doctors began to reference it that way due to the awful nature of the project, choosing defenseless children, and the active abuse it applied to get results and data. The children suffered long-term speech and psychological effects from the experiment in the end. Iowa University half apologized for the study in 2001, saying something along the lines of, "Sorry, but we got really great data from that study." Number 1. The good old nature or nurture study. Dr. Reimer's case is arguably one of the most complicated medical experiments that took place on a human being. Born fraternal twin, during circumcision, the surgeon made a mistake that caused irreparable damage to David's penis. To make the best of a terrible situation, David was placed in a study of nature versus nurture, where a psychologist, John Money, would try to confirm his theory that gender was a learned behavior. From that point forward, David was raised as Brenda. For roughly 10 years, Money followed up on David's case, keeping his twin brother as a control case. The experiment went south, as David always felt like a boy while growing up. Throughout his teen years and throughout adulthood, he struggled with depression and suicidal tendencies. Upon finding out of his sex change, his depression worsened until finally committing suicide at the age of 38. Thanks for watching. Want to participate as a human being in something that isn't scary and is completely safe and beneficial? Become one of our loyal archivists by subscribing to the channel, clicking the bell for notifications of newly released videos covering a variety of interesting topics. Give this video a like and leave your comments about which of these experiments on humans you thought were the worst.